from Psalm 121. Ya da 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 da, 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 ya da 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 da. El harim mehayin yavo ezri esahenai el harim mehayin yavo ezri mehim Adonai Ose shamayim va'aretz ezri mehim Adonai Ose shamayim va'aretz. In your booklets, in the first page, sing with me in English, Psalm 121. I lift my eyes to the mountains. What is the source of my help? I lift my eyes to the mountain. What is the source of my help? My help comes from Adonai, maker of heaven and earth. My help comes from Adonai, maker of heaven and earth. Ya da 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 da, ya da 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 da, ya da 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 da, ya da 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 da.
Death has taken our beloved Howard. Our friends grieve in their darkened world. In their silence, there is lamentation. In their tears, there is loneliness. Lost in their sorrow, may they find the presence of loving friends. Hear them, O God, and be with them. For Howard's love that united us in life, and which death cannot sever. For his companionship that we shared along life's path, and which continues through the tenderness of memory. For the gifts of his heart and mind that brought us joy and happiness, and are now a precious remembrance. For all these and more, we give our thanks. In this time of grief, we listen to the voice of our sacred scriptures that brings us the ever-new message of God's nearness. It tells of our kinship with the Creator, in light as in darkness, in joy as in sorrow, in life as in death. These words now are Psalm 23.
Mizmor leDavid, Adonai roi lo echsar, binoteshe yarbitzeni, al mei menuchot yenaleni, nafshi yeshovev, yancheni v'magle tzedek, למען שמו. גם כי הלך בגיא צל מוות, לא אירא רע, כי אתה עמדי. שבטך ומשענתך המה תערוך לפני שולחן נגד סורריי. תשנת בשמן ראשי, כוסי רוויה. אך טוב וחסד ירדפוני כל ימי חיי, ושבתי בבית אדוני לאורך ימים.
The words in English now in the prayer booklets on the left side of the page. God is my shepherd, I shall not want. You make me lie down in green pastures and lead me beside still waters. You restore my soul. You lead me in right paths for the sake of your name. Even when I walk in the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You have set a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You have anointed my head with oil, my cup overflows. Goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of God forever. These words below that, we remember them. We offer these words with condolences in particular to all of Howard's friends, colleagues, and especially to Pat, Adam, Melissa, their spouses, and their children. And I offer these words on behalf of our entire congregation at Temple Sinai, which was so important to Howard. And in particular, to me, he's one of the first people that I met. He was a member of our board when I first came to Temple Sinai in 2010, and an active participant and regular member, and not the kind of person who just took what was offered or presented to him. And so I will say it helped me from those earliest days to be ready with more than just simple answers and prepared to explain and debate and discuss. And on behalf of all of us who've grown and learned and benefited from him, I offer these words. In the rising of the sun and in its going down, we remember him. In the blowing of the wind and in the chill of winter, we remember him. In the opening of buds and in the rebirth of spring, we remember him. In the blueness of the sky and in the warmth of the sun, we remember him. In the rustling of the leaves and in the beauty of autumn, we remember him. In the beginning of the year and when it ends, we remember him. When we are weary and in need of strength, we remember him. When we are lost and sick at heart, we remember him. When we have joys we yearn to share, we remember him. So long as we live, he too shall live, for he is now a part of us as we remember him. I'll invite a few people now to come up here to the podium to share their words of remembrance, to join this tribute as we remember him together. First, Howard's daughter, Melissa.
Good morning. Thank you all for joining us in person and online. Howard Moskof, my father, was larger than life. A man who used his gifts to achieve the American dream and help others, including his family, to chase their dreams. He believed that if you know someone, even a little, you should be able to select a meaningful gift for them. This led to some interesting shopping expeditions for my mother's birthday, mostly because she is the opposite and likes very specific gifts that she sometimes chooses herself. We would head out to the stores right before Thanksgiving, Dad with a very clear idea in mind, and me armed with a suggestion from Mom about what she might want, whispered in my ear on the way out the door. He didn't listen. She was ultimately happy because Dad selected well. He knew her and loved to surprise and delight her. So this morning, in his honor, here's a gift of some stories about him and a perspective on who he was, because he loved to think and talk and come up with a perspective, and there was nothing more than he liked than to tell a good story. My father had a big intellect. There are, of course, the academic accomplishments, starting with skipping a grade in elementary school, moving on to graduating high school at 16 and heading to Colgate, progressing to his time at Yale Law School, where the Socratic method became part of his soul. Professionally, Dad was equally successful in every stage of his career in the public and private arenas and set the bar high for Adam and me in terms of work ethic. Beyond the accomplishments, Dad was a lifelong learner, eager to read, discuss, understand, ponder, argue, and question. You've all likely been on the receiving end of a complex Howard Moskof opinion, with a point of view pulled from decades of reading and listening to news shows, and to you. He was equally interested in hearing your perspective and then debating with you, starting with the question, what is the question? A trait he passed on to my brother. Dad also had a big heart. He had a deep love for his family, most of all my mother, his partner in life and love. Their 53rd anniversary would have been this week. Their marriage set the standard for me and my brother. We admired their support for each other, their exploration of their common interests, including travel, cooking, reading, and the arts, and love for their 5 grandsons. I often heard first about my nephew's accomplishments from their proud grandpa. We will all miss his big hugs. My dad's big heart also showed up in his commitments to helping others and the institutions with which we were all involved. He was always generous with his time and resources. My father sat on boards and committees for institutions and principles important to him. The Committee for a Responsible Budget, Georgetown Day School, and Temple Sinai, to name a few. He gave to others and taught us the value of philanthropy and service. The majority of his work hours, and there were many, were focused on improving the availability of and access to affordable housing in the United States. His passion started in New Haven and was spurred on by trying to fulfill the ideals of Kennedy's New Frontier and Johnson's Great Society. Now, Dad's big appetite was known by all. Yes, for food, as everyone who knew him is aware, especially if it was something interesting and authentic. There's a pile of untried recipes next to a folder of restaurant reviews on his desk right now. Dad's appetite was also for learning new things. He had a lot of hobbies, including fishing, which led us on many a wonderful vacation, reading, mostly history, biography, and mysteries, which he liked to share and informed his sophisticated, knowledgeable worldview, travel, photography, cooking, the list goes on and on. I would be remiss if I did not mention his appetite for cultivating friendships and meeting interesting people, as evidenced by the large community of friends here and online. He was a connector before Malcolm Gladwell coined the term. In 1984, our family traveled across the U.S. and then went to live in Italy. During both parts of that 6-month trip, we met friends of my parents from many phases in their lives. My father so enjoyed meeting people, hearing their stories and sharing his, yes, some of them over and over again, prefaced with, "This is a funny story." Most of all, my father had a big love of life. He taught us to enjoy the ride, to laugh and keep going, even if you fall out of the canoe into the rapids, get stranded in the desert in Morocco, run out of gas on the highway, don't know where you will sleep after a long day of travel through the Alps in Italy, and all of those things happened. Because you might find something wonderful, like a hotel in the back of a furniture store in the town of San Pellegrino in Italy. But you always had a good story. All of these adventures were ways to explore the world and are now stories in our family lore, things we have learned. We'll miss you, Dad. And so in your name, we'll continue to search for opportunities to create our own stories through adventures big and small, talking with strangers, finding an off-the-beaten-path restaurant, exploring our hobbies, and building communities full of love and support in your name.
Thank you, Louise. Would Michael Lemmo please join us? Michael.
Good morning. I guess we're doing this in the order of age. Oldest first. I actually have known Howard, who we honor today, but remember forever, for over 60 years. I stopped counting when I reached my sixth finger. I met Howard at Colgate University in Hamilton, New York in the 1950s. So the thing I noticed about Howard was he was a fighter. He wanted to accomplish things, but he didn't make enemies. He didn't get angry. He did it in a way which is very unusual. And that's why I believe family, friends, Pat, Howard's legacy will live on. His memory is secure. A couple of stories. So at Colgate, Howard was a star. He was a swimmer on the Colgate swimming team, and I was a cub reporter on the Colgate newspaper called the Maroon. So they sent me to the pool to watch a meet where Howard was competing for Colgate, I guess, maybe against Cornell. And I was stunned. Howard was doing the backstroke. You know how a backstroker grabs the wall and flips around and comes out halfway down the pool? I couldn't even hold my breath for a couple of strokes. So I wrote the article. It was featured in the Maroon about Colgate's star, now known as the Shark. So I thought Howard would be very angry at this, sort of degraded his sport. But he laughed, and he thought it was funny, and he made me, a cub reporter, feel a lot better. Now, Howard and I were both presidents of the Colgate Young Democrats. This was quite simple. I mean, first of all, we didn't serve at the same time, but there were only a couple of us on campus. Everybody else was a Republican in upstate New York. So to get a president of the Young Democrats wasn't hard at all. But Howard did it with charm, and he even got a few converts. We were two New York City guys, one from Bronx High School of Science, Howard, myself from Stuyvesant High School, graduate of Stuyvesant, way up there in the hills of the Shenango Valley. And you would think we would have been kind of lost, not with too many friends, and that was true of me. I was an independent, which meant you couldn't get into a fraternity. Maybe whatever reasons, who knows. But Howard was grabbed by rushed by some of the biggest houses on campus because of his manner of bringing people together, of communicating and achieving things. So we were both strangers in a foreign land. He handled it a bit better than I did. We parted ways, and then he went on to Yale, to a distinguished record in the district attorney's office in New Haven and in the Redevelopment and Land Agency, which I'm sure Ralph Werner, our classmate, will mention. But I have one other incident I want to tell you about Howard to reflect on what I remember of a significant, powerful human being who had grace and warmth as well. So years later, Howard joined a big law firm, kind of like the KDRs at Colgate. He joined Hogan and Hartson, which was a premier law firm in Washington. They wouldn't let me in the door, but that was maybe I was difficult, who knows. So Howard was a partner at Hogan and Hartson. I was chief counsel of a congressional committee that was fighting over the right of the Congress to get information from the President of the United States, it was Richard Nixon at the time, about issues of legislative concern. So I stumbled into a big issue, and as usual, Congress and the legislative branch were deadlocked. So I'm sitting in the office of my wonderful leader and boss, Chairman John Moss of California, and he said, "Mike, we need to take them to court. They can't deny the Congress information." Sound familiar? This is 30 years ago, in the 70s. So I said, let's get Howard's firm, Hogan and Hartson. Howard will take a personal interest. And he did. And so I called Howard. I remember sitting in my office, and he said, "Oh, sure, we'll do it. That's a risky thing for a law firm. In Washington, you take on the administration, you take on the industries that they protect. In this case, it was the oil industry. Moss was fighting to lower natural gas rates for the consumer. Howard said, "We'll take it. Don't worry about it. We're not worried." So they went to court, Howard and E. Barrett Prettyman, his partner. They argued the case. We won. And you'll read somewhere in the law books that the oil industry it was actually a natural gas industry, was required to deliver data on their prices, which caused, I really never sat down and figured out the exact amount, but caused a savings of millions of dollars over a decade to consumers who paid lower prices for natural gas because there was really more gas in the ground than the industry would admit. So Howard took that fight on. He won it, but he won it in style. He didn't make enemies. So that's my point about, in concluding, is to say it's tough to be a tough guy and be nice about it. And you can all remember your husband and father and grandfather as that kind of man. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. Now I invite Ralph Werner to join us, please.
My name is Ralph Werner. Howard Moskof was an immense, revered presence in our lives and will surely be missed. He was a loving and beloved husband, father, and grandfather. He was especially fortunate to have Pat as his wife to help him navigate life. Howard and I met in 1960 and quickly became and continued as friends throughout his life. From his early days, in early years growing up in the Bronx, New York, he displayed the talents and qualities that characterized him in life. He attended Bronx High School of Science and then Colgate University. At both schools, he was a standout backstroke swimmer with a classic, tall, broad-shouldered, lean-bodied torso. Howard achieved great success in his endeavors, and he was endeared to and admired by his colleagues and friends, and earned the respect of all he encountered in his career in life. In the early 1960s, after graduating from Yale Law School, he was living in New Haven and working in urban renewal for the city government led by the legendary Mayor Dick Lee, which at the time was the locale of one of the most successful urban renewal programs in the country. During that time, we spent summer weekends together with our friends, first in the Berkshires, and later on Long Island. Howard was very athletic. In addition to being a varsity backstroke swimmer in high school and at Colgate, he also was a formidable tennis player with a very strong serve. If memory serves, he won most of our tennis matches in those days and over the following years in Washington, although I started to catch up in later years. In addition to his athletic skills, he had the added ingredient of being very competitive, not only in games, but in his other activities. Howard was equipped with a wonderful intellect, a great curiosity, a deep and abiding dedication to his endeavors, and supreme self-confidence. He enjoyed new challenges and solving difficult problems. All of those qualities drew and enabled him to take on increasingly difficult and important tasks in his work and endeared him to his colleagues and the people for whom he worked. When Howard came to Washington in 1965 as development director and general counsel of the D.C. Redevelopment Land Agency, which ran the district's urban renewal program, he had a major role in rejuvenating the then stagnant Southwest Urban Renewal Project. Howard was also restless and ambitious. He soon left to become executive director of the Federal Kaiser Commission, which President Johnson, as part of the Great Society vision, tasked with developing new federal housing programs that would enable the country to provide for our booming population, the needs of our cities and suburban communities, and the needs of our poorer citizens. Howard's commission report led to the 1968 Housing and Urban Development Act, which enabled this progress. Again, Howard did not rest at that point. He soon went on to accept new challenges in the housing field and in development, where he held important leadership positions and made significant contributions. His efforts were all marked with success. Among Howard's many talents and accomplishments, he loved bringing together interesting people he believed could help others. He was insatiable in engaging in debate on significant issues, on legal and other subjects of interest. He was forever curious to find the deeper meaning or motivations in the particular subject. He would not accept facile answers. Not least among his talents was his skill as a baker who prepared rockola for his grandson's britches. Howard lived and enjoyed a full life. Even when limited by his infirmities, he did not give up, but persevered and continued to travel and engage in social events with family and friends. He was a dear and loyal friend. My wife, Gail, and I have had a close and enjoyable relationship with Howard and Pat, whose wedding we attended in 1968, and whose children, Melissa and Adam, we watched grow up and become parents of 5 sons. We shall miss him dearly and give our heartfelt sympathy to his family.
Thank you, Ralph Warner. Adam Dorfman will join us now, sharing some remarks that were sent by Howard's friend Harris Barrow.
Thank you. I was given the honor of sharing these words from Harris Barrow, who's another of Howard's very dear friends from back at his Colgate days. I'll just say quickly on my own that I was given the incredible gift of knowing him for almost 30 years, of sharing love and family, of learning from him, of vigorously exchanging opinions when they differed. And it was just such a privilege to know this incredibly warm and caring and intelligent man. From Harris, Howard and I were friends for almost 70 years. We grew up together, helped one another, and could always count on one another. If Howard were your friend and you went to him for advice, he gave it to you short and direct, did not sugarcoat it, insisted that you meet it head on and get on with your life. Or put simply, he believed in the power of truth as a balm for what ailed you. Few people operate this way, and it assumed that you knew he loved you, and his advice was in that context. When we met, he was a kid from the Bronx and I from Queens, both products of the 50s and both probably repressed. Much of him, at that time, or so I thought, was formed by the 10-mile River Boy Scout Camp, Bronx science, his dad's laundry, and of course his curiosity. He was taller than most, and I subscribed to the theory that tall people start off with more confidence than others because people are always looking up to them. Leadership came naturally to him, as witnessed by his many professional successes, and he bore it the way he swam the backstroke, gracefully. I shall miss him in so many ways. Good night and goodbye, and may bands of angels sing him to his heavenly rest. Love, Harris.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you, Harris. And now I ask David Rabin to join us to share some remarks. David Rabin.
Good morning. I'm David Rabin. It's been very nice to hear about Howard from those of you who have known him for many, many years. Sadly, I didn't have that privilege. I first met Howard about 5 years ago at the same boat lunches, where I would often enjoy his thoughtful questions and informed remarks. But at that time, Howard and I connected on a more personal level, since he was on the threshold of a major cardiac operation. And I, having been a physician in this city for many years, had some sense of opportunities and difficulties in cardiac surgery. So had the pleasure of, on a personal level, of making suggestions about that notable event in his life. Subsequently, when he was recovering from that and other illnesses, we began to talk about next steps in life as he returned to his home with a contemplation of where one would go next, an active concern of mine simultaneously. So that was how our friendship began. Not a long, but a very meaningful one for me and for my wife. We went out with our wives, visited each other's homes. In ours, he immediately recognized some of our furniture made by George Nakashima, a Japanese-American woodworker and architect. Unlike many people, Howard knew all about Nakashima's work. He also appreciated our Native American baskets and pottery, a collection that I began when I lived on the Navajo reservation. The reason he so responded became clear when we visited his home. It was filled with beautiful ethnic objects, thoughtfully placed, including pre-Columbian pieces that he and Pat had collected while living in Texas and traveling. Our shared love of beautiful ethnic objects became a bond between us, something we enjoyed and talked about. We also talked about books and, of course, politics. He would often mention books he was reading, as did Pat, both of which enriched our lives. He asked Darcy, my wife, what she was reading. He wanted to share books he was reading, like Daniel Mendelssohn's An Odyssey, about his father's becoming a student at Bard College, and Yuval Harari's *Sapiens: A History of Mankind*. Howard's easy manner and cheerful disposition were apparent just a few weeks ago when we joined him and Pat at dinner here at Riderwood. He was looking remarkably fit while scooting around in his motorized chair. Howard was a big man in intellect and stature, but remarkably gentle and sweet in manner. Ours was a too brief relationship, but one leaving us with treasured moments, rich with shared values and beliefs. His departure is so sad.
I'm Rabbi Hannah Goldstein. I'm one of the rabbis at Temple Sinai. And I learned yesterday from Melissa and Adam that every week when they were growing up, Shabbat dinner was a command performance. They could go out afterward, but during dinner on Friday night, the family would gather and discuss a Torah portion. Not necessarily the Torah portion of the week, but a Torah portion. So in honor of the Moskof family tradition, I want to mention this week's Torah portion, Ki Tavo. It includes a text that is somewhat well known. It also appears in the Passover Haggadah. Moses is speaking to the assembled Israelites as they prepare to go into the promised land. And he tells them that they should bring their first fruits as an offering before God, and they should say, Arami Oved Avi, my father was a wandering Aramaean. The ritual for the offering continues as they stand before God. They are to describe the journey to Egypt, the harsh treatment by the Egyptians, God's intervention, and the ultimate arrival in the promised land. The text concludes, the Eternal freed us from Egypt by a mighty hand, by an outstretched arm and awesome power, and by signs and portents bringing us to this place and giving us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. In essence, God is telling the people, when you get to the promised land, when you reap the first fruits of your harvest, never forget where you come from. Be grateful for what you have. Know that you have been granted the gift of an extraordinary legacy. It is a fitting text as we remember Howard today. Arami Aved Avi, my father was a wandering Aramaean. Howard never forgot where he came from. For all of his success, and his success was abundant, his academic success, his professional success, he worked for presidents, drafted legislation, revived the housing and commerce in major cities. Howard was a proud son of the Bronx. He helped out in the family business, a hand laundry. When he was home on break from Yale Law School, he wasn't too busy to help deliver the laundry. Howard knew where he came from, and he knew where he was going. Howard was a visionary. He always had his eye on that land flowing with milk and honey. Howard was a person who could see the world as it might be. His career was varied, but the through line of everything he did was that he helped conceive of big, bold, creative visions, and then he worked to actualize them. From revitalizing New Haven to Washington, D.C., serving as the staff director of President Johnson's Committee on Urban Housing, bringing his vision and expertise to the national level, playing an instrumental role in housing policy and drafting legislation, studying how to help the poor in this country in a meaningful, transformative way, working on transit, developing housing. Howard spent his life creating, and he leaves a legacy poured into the foundation of housing developments, a legacy that echoes in bustling downtowns, that is embedded in train tracks and etched into street signs. Howard lived the American dream, and he helped dream of a better America. Howard knew who he was and where he was going, and he also knew what was really important: his beloved Pat, his companion and partner, his children, Melissa and Adam. Whenever possible, Howard was home for dinner, even if he had to continue working afterwards. He led the weekend adventures, cooking and fishing, tracking down hard-to-find ingredients, trying out a new restaurant, Howard was present for his family and for the friends he made and kept all over the country and all over the world. As Melissa said, he believed that everyone was interesting. You just had to ask the right question. Our community at Temple Sinai has been blessed by Howard's energy, vision, and dedication. A member of our board of trustees and the finance and planning committee, chair of ARTSA, an engaged adult learner, and more recently, Howard was involved with our building modernization work. It is fitting that as we sit here in the chapel at Riderwood today, there is a flurry of activity in the Temple Sinai Sanctuary as they put the finishing touches on the renovated space. It is just one more space touched by Howard's legacy. And still we know that it's not just the places, but primarily it is the people who will carry Howard's memory forward. All of those who loved and were loved by Howard. In the ritual described in this week's Torah portion, after you offer the first fruits to God, the text then says, "And you shall enjoy all the bounty that Adonai your God has bestowed upon you and your households." Howard loved life, and he truly appreciated its bounty. He delighted in the beauty of the arts, cooking and eating delicious food, the experience of soaking up another culture on a trip, the majesty of the world captured through a camera lens. He loved people, friends, and strangers. He was proud of his work. He loved his family. Howard knew that he had been blessed, appreciated the bounty that had been bestowed upon him. Now, as we begin to imagine life without Howard, we appreciate the gift of Howard's life, of having learned from him, of having debated with him, of having delighted in the gift of Howard's company, the gift of having known and loved Howard. May his memory always be a blessing.
Amen. These words from Ecclesiastes inside your booklets on the top right of the page. A season is set for everything, a time for every experience under heaven, a time for being born and a time for dying, a time for planting and a time for uprooting the planted, a time for slaying and a time for healing, a time for tearing down and a time for building up, a time for weeping and a time for laughing, a time for wailing and a time for dancing, a time for throwing stones and a time for gathering stones, a time for embracing and a time for shunning embraces, a time for seeking and a time for losing, a time for keeping and a time for discarding, a time for ripping and a time for sewing, a time for loving and a time for hating, a time for war and a time for peace, a time for silence and a time for speaking. I invite you now to take a few moments of silent prayer, reflection, meditation in Howard's memory. Zichrono livracha, may his memory be a blessing. We now offer the words of El Malei Rachamim, the memorial prayer recited in Howard's name, and I invite those who are able, please, to rise.
שוכן במרומים, המצא מנוחה נכונה, תחת כנפי השכינה, במעלות קדושים וטהורים כזוהר הרקיע מזהירים את נשמת יחזקאל בן יוסף וחנה שהלך לעולמו בגן עדן תהא מנוחתו. אנא בעל הרחמים הסתירהו בסתר כנפיך לעולמים וצרור בצרור החיים את נשמתו. אדוני הוא נחלתו וינוח בשלום על משכבו ונאמר אמן.
A few announcements before the English translation of that prayer. As a reminder, the burial service will be at 1:30 p.m. at the Garden of Remembrance at Temple Sinai Cemetery section there. And with respect to the tradition, but because of the circumstances of the pandemic currently, there will not be Shiva held. But I do encourage you, please, to continue reaching out to Pat and to Howard's family and to each other and share all of those stories that you have in honor of his life. On the bottom right of the page, the English for El Malei Rachamim. May the source of life, the fountain of all being, open our hearts to compassion and our eyes to wisdom, that we might glimpse in perfect peace and sadness the way of all things. May Howard Moskof's memory be for us a blessing, and may we never let the light of his love grow dim in our hearts. May we remember all his worthy and righteous deeds, that his memory be forever bound up in the bond of life. God is our source and our destination, our beginning and our end. May Howard's death awaken us to this truth, that the bond of love we shared and share not be severed in sorrow. May he rest in peace. Together we say, Amen.
Ladies and gentlemen, at this time, the portion of the service here at the Riderwood Chapel is concluded. If you are able to join us at Garden of Remembrance at 1:30, as Rabbi Roos mentioned, we will be gathering there at the Temple Sinai section in the cemetery. There will be arrows, so you'll be able to find that. And we do have copies of directions if you need those before you leave here. Ladies and gentlemen, at this time, will the pallbearers please come forward?
שוכן במרומים, המצא מנוחה נכונה, תחת כנפי השכינה, במעלות קדושים וטהורים, כזוהר הרקיע מזהירים. את נשמת יחזקאל בן יוסף וחנה שהלך לעולמו בגן עדן תהא מנוחתו. אנא בעל הרחמים הסתירהו בסתר כנפיך לעולמים, וצרור בצרור החיים את נשמתו. אדוני הוא נחלתו, וינוח בשלום על משכבו, ונאמר